So I would now like to welcome a very warm welcome to our first speaker, Mike Hughes, the president of Schneider Electric UK and Ireland. Mike joins us as our keynote speaker. Mike, thank you very, very much indeed for hosting this EV Summit Schneider Electric Drive to Zero event this morning. Absolutely delighted to have you join us. Mike, as an opening question, could you tell us a little bit more about Schneider Electric's work, its strategy and its mission to net zero, particularly with reference to the e-mobility sector?
Yes, absolutely. And again, let me just thank again, Ed, to be able to work together in partnering on this event as Schneider Electric. It's net zero is a topic that is extremely important for us, and it's something that we as Schneider Electric take extremely seriously. And of course, this EV journey is a major part of that. I don't know if we're able to share. I had just one or two slides. I don't know if we're able to see that as we go through. Yes, there we go. So this is just to facilitate our discussion. A little bit about Schneider Electric. What is Schneider Electric and why is this topic important for us? So we're a global technology company. We play pretty much in every country around the world. And what our whole focus is on is around this future of electrification, automation, and digitization. And I just want to get across a view of what's important to us as a company. We're a 27 billion company. We're a signed up, committed member to the 1.5 degree coalition around global warming. We are participants and active members and commitments on the EV 100, which is a commitment to have all of our vehicles electric, the renewable 100 and the energy performance 100. So we are a serious player in terms of not just bringing technology to the market that can help other companies become net zero, but we ourselves are making serious commitments on that. So we have publicly announced that our ambition is to be carbon neutral by 2025 and net zero by 2030 within our full supply chain scope by 2050. Now, these are pretty ambitious targets for our sector, but I hope it brings across the importance of the topic of sustainability and net zero to us as a company. You can see we have a very good global footprint. We operate in all of the major markets of the world. And down on the bottom, it just gives you a flavor of the markets that we work in: commercial and industrial buildings, data centers, industry, infrastructure, etc. Now, what's interesting about those is that's where the energy is being consumed. So Schneider is effectively playing in the markets where the large volumes of energy are being consumed. And of course, now transportation is becoming electric, and the EV story is a big part of that. So hopefully that just gives you a flavor of who we are and why this topic is extremely important for us.
Thanks so much for setting the scene there. So, I mean, you've just outlined how EV charging is a big play for Schneider Electric, but I know from our previous conversations that there's a wider narrative around the energy required for that sector and also for heating. Could you tell us a little bit more about that wider narrative?
Yeah, sure. So I wanted to use the opportunity to just share with everybody our topic today is around EV. So if we can pull up the next slide. But EV is not existing on its own within this, let's call it the digital clean power revolution, okay? And just a few thoughts to share with you that we see happening across those markets that we operate in, and indeed the different geographies that we operate in. Now, the EV story we will talk about in more detail, but what I wanted to get across to you is that this EV story is happening in the middle of a massive revolution around the way the whole grid and the energy has been managed. Okay? So if you just look at the messages on the slide here, if we go back to 2008, the UK, and we'll talk about the UK today a little bit, effectively had about 80 points of generation. That's 80 places in the geography which were officially generating power. And you had about 4.9% of that power coming from renewable energy. Now, if you pump forward to 2050, and obviously we're on that journey, you're going to have over 1 million plus points of generation. Now, that's a complete fragmentation of the generation side of the grid. And the projections are saying the renewable energy will up to around 85% of the energy being fed into that grid. Now, that's a massive technical challenge. not just about how much you need more power, but also where it's coming from and how to manage this fragmentation of the grid. Now, that is all happening. I'm moving to the top right. That is all happening within what is projected to be an increase of demand from around 308 terawatt hours up to 530. And you can see this is being driven by, first of all, EV. About 40% of that new demand is from EV. But look at residential heating. Residential heating is also a huge part of the net zero story for the UK. So 45% of the new demand will actually be coming from residential heating, and you have about 15% coming from the rest of the economy. So the EV story is existing within a story of grid fragmentation on generation, increased demand. And the last point is that if we get to the projected 37 million electric vehicles by 2050, you will end up for the first time in history of an electrical grid having roughly 17% of the demand, which is mobile. That means 17% of your national demand can theoretically move around and appear in a place that you may not have thought about. So it's just to share with you how the EV story is extremely important in this journey, but also to give you the background of what that is sitting on, what is behind that, and the complexity that this journey is going to be.
Thanks so much indeed, Mike. So you mentioned a little bit there about the demand side, the energy side, the EV side. Could you tell us a little bit more about the grid and the generation sides and how Schneider Electric fits into that with your ecosystem of provision?
Yeah, sure. So let's move on to the next slide and talk a little bit about the way the EV market is going to generate, and then we talk about the grid. So this is, I think, the journey that everybody knows from the topic today. We're going to move from around 300,000 EVs up to a projected 6 million. The charging points will have to go from something like 20,000 or public charging points up to 100,000. And the national grid investment that will be required will be quite large. The government is putting a lot of money into this topic because, of course, there can be no net zero without the capability of the infrastructure to put behind it. But the last point I'd like to get across here is a very interesting one, is that EVs, while being a part of the challenge, are actually a huge part of the solution. So if you think about 36 million electric vehicles on the road, that actually has, just through the battery capability, the ability to deliver around 2.2 terawatt hours of power. So EVs are going to be a major part of this transition of the grid in terms of stabilizing the grid and acting through bidirectional flow of energy as a major backup capability for stabilizing the grid. So EVs are a huge part of the challenge, but they're also a massive part of the solution around how the grid is going to manage that going forward.
Thanks so much indeed, Mike. So I mean, the bidirectional charging side leads neatly onto a question I'd like to ask you about smart charging. So with that huge rise in power, with the bidirectional side you've just outlined, there will be a really powerful role for smart charging. What's your position point on that side of things at Schneider Electric?
Yes, I mean, smart charging will be the future of EV and of the grid. So as I say, the capability to have bidirectional flow of energy will be essential in order to make the grid work. Now, if we move on to the next slide, we can see the complexity that is behind that to make that available. It's not just about obviously building EV chargers and then plugging in your car. So to make this market work and this bidirectional charging work and the whole structure of being able to run a grid like that, you have a lot of other functions, services, software that needs to be built, not just the hardware, in terms of facilitating that whole grid of the future. The fundamental piece of it will be is that you will have to be able to charge your car when it is efficient for you and for the grid, and you will have to discharge your car and back onto the grid at a time when that is also efficient and required for the grid. So this bidirectional capability will be absolutely essential to master this complexity that is coming on the grid.
Thanks so much indeed, Mike. Just a quick word for our online audience. We very much welcome questions from an online audience. So if you have any questions for Mike or indeed any of our other speakers, please do submit those questions now. Conscious that we have an all-male lineup of speakers, so if we have any questions from women in the audience, please do submit those questions to us. We're very much looking forward to seeing those questions. Mike, a final question from me before we do hand over to some questions from the online audience. there's definitely a fragmented grid that we can talk about. How does the Schneider Electric technology proposition deliver the technology required for the electrification of mobility, from distribution to battery storage and connection to the charging side?
Yes, and I think this is the exciting part of the story. So again, if we take the last slide, the technology, this is really a technology story. And the beauty of the situation is that the technologies are essentially there. They're evolving very quickly. A lot of my fellow panelists today are involved in those technologies as well. And this is just our sort of very high level overview of what that grid is going to look like. And you can see at different levels, different technologies are going to have to take place. So you have the whole story at the end user piece, which is your smart home, your smart building, your industry, the whole behind the meter story, and then how that connects to the grid, how the grid does battery backup storage, how the grid does balancing, how you switch in and out renewables as they are required. Remember that today, hundreds of millions are being spent at times when there is a large generation of wind power that cannot be used. And generators are sometimes being asked to turn off power, not to generate power. Now that could all be going into batteries and being backing up either in vehicles or large battery backup systems on the grid, which help to stabilize it. Then you're back to distribution, transmission, and of course the whole mixed generation topic that we talked about, the fragmentation of the grid. The solution to all of this is technology. Now, as Schneider Electric, we play in a lot of those spaces, but we are not exclusive to this. We partner with many companies across the story to be able to deliver this technology grid of the future.
We'll come back onto the battery question with our second speaker, Matt Allen from Pivot Power. But I'd like to now just throw open some questions from our online audience. We've had many questions come in. Mike, you'll be delighted to hear. Here's an interesting first question from Lester Evelyn, who asks, does Schneider have any views on the AC-DC split for those 100,000 chargers you mentioned?
Yes, I mean, we are, like all companies, we are watching closely to see how this market is going to evolve. And it's not just an AC story on the charger itself. It's actually related more to that whole grid story. Okay? So, just another point to think about, it's not just AC-DC on the charger. One of the big challenges we see, particularly in the residential space, is the typical home is going to go from using around 3,200 kilowatt hours of electrical energy to something like 10 or 11. That's a 3 or 4 times increase. And you have another technical discussion going on there around saying, well, we need to move to 3-phase power in the home. So that the AC-DC charging story is linked up with a much wider discussion. And, as Schneider Electric, we watch always the different technology stories that are going on in the market to make sure that we try, as everybody else, to pick the ones that we believe in the end are going to be successful.
Thanks very much indeed, Mike. I'm delighted to say we now have our first question from a woman in the audience, and it's from Sarah Sloman, who I think many people would know well. Sarah asks quite a specific question about ports, Mike. So she says, thinking about the large-scale decarbonisation challenges and potential electrification of vessels, ships, how would you recommend port operators seek to invest in the required grid connection upgrades and generation storage options?
Yeah, this is a great question, Sarah, and a very relevant one and a pertinent one, of course, because the whole ship-shore connection story has been going on for a number of years now. It's become fairly well known that, when ships are coming into port, they're having to run on their diesel engines while they're sitting in the ports, and there's a desire of governments, etc., to get legislation so that ships will have to electrically connect to the port system once they come in. So there are technological solutions for that. It's purely a matter of investment. I think that discussion is still going on around who should the investors be. Should it be the ship operators? Should it be the port operators? But it is a topic that is coming. I'm very pleased that at Schneider Electric, we've already been involved in a number of those projects, particularly one up in Orkney, where they built a ship-shore connection and it's now running 100% on renewable energy. So very good question. Another area of the economy that is not discussed a lot, but the whole ship-shore connection topic is another major part of this transition to net zero.
Yeah, I think perhaps all overlook the fact that ships are another form of vehicle. The passenger vehicle perhaps takes precedence in much of the conversation. Here's a question from Dan Epstein, who asks, who do you think will manage the grid and how will it be rolled out with regards to the role that local authorities and other public sector bodies like TfL will have in the transformation?
Yeah, again, a very good question. I mean, I think this is a moving target. There will clearly be some kind of governance around the grid, a little bit like we have as National Grid today. But what you can see clearly, the journey has already started with the DNO companies today transitioning to what they call DSO, district service operators, where on a regional level, they are going to have to figure out how they balance their local grids, etc. I think what's going to change very much is that the behind the meter players, the large consumers of energy, buildings, industry, data centers, and it's a little bit touching back on the EV story, this concept of bidirectional contracting, of demand response is going to be a major part of how the grid will work in the future. So you're going to have a quite complex set of switching in and switching out. And this is the point I was making about fragmentation of the grid. You have a complete fragmentation on the generation side, but you're also having a fragmentation and complexity on the demand side. You're going to need some good governance and some good technology behind that to make sure that the whole thing comes together. But I think the journey has already started. And as I say, the technology is already there, and the DNOs are also quite clear about how they're going to master that.